What's your true, unexplainable, downright creepy story? Story 1. My family moved to this standard upscale suburban home after roughing it for a couple of years to save up. We also got a deal on the home because it had been a model home before it was ours, meaning it had all the fake furniture used to show off the neighborhood houses. Anyway, it had this loft area with two stairwells that went up to it, one in the front and one in the back, and you could pretty much hear everything from this loft since it was so open. One day, my two best friends, a guy and a girl, were hanging out in the loft. We were in high school and they were always all over each other, whether I was in the room or not. We were watching television and I got up to go to the bathroom. When I left, they were all over each other. And when I came back, they were on different ends of the couch. I thought they had gotten into a fight, so I asked what was going on. The guy said that my little sister was home, and my face turned completely white. The girl asked what was wrong, and I asked them why they thought that. They said they heard her, and at that point I started freaking out because no one else was supposed to be home. I told them no one was there, and we checked the entire house, and I was right. Later, it turned out that before it was a model home, a family had lived there, and a little girl had been playing in the loft, climbed on the railing, and fell to her death below. My two best friends swear to this day that they heard what they thought was my sister laughing and running up the stairs, hitting her hands on each step like she was running up on all fours. I never had any encounters myself other than the fact that right next to where she landed was the house's central intercom system, since we had an intercom in every room where you could play music or talk to each other. Every so often at night, always around the same time, you would wake up to the intercom button being pressed and hear only the blank static sound, like someone was holding the button down but not speaking. My room was on the third floor, and I would have to walk all the way down to the main unit on the bottom floor to turn it off. I always thought I would see her standing there. Story 2. When I was a baby, we lived in a big old manor house with my grandparents. One night my dad woke up in the middle of the night and saw what looked like a ghost of my mom on top of the bed, screaming and trying to get into my mom's sleeping body. And it scared him so badly that he refused to ever go back to that house, and we eventually moved out. When I was about 6 years old, we were living in our own apartment. One morning, just after we woke up, my mom went to make a warm cup of milk for both of us. It was winter, the lights were off in the room, but they were on in the corridor. I vividly remember seeing the dust in the air come together and form a ghost in the shape of my mom, but dressed like she was from the 1800s. And it walked out of the room following my mom without acknowledging me in any way. It was the most surreal thing I have ever seen, and I can still remember it clearly to this day. Story 3. I was invited to a sleepover at my friend's house when I was 9 or 10 years old. It was in a rundown, crime-ridden part of town, and I was already nervous about the whole thing. It turned out my friend planned for us to sleep in tents outside in the backyard. We went to sleep, and I unexpectedly woke up in the middle of the night to find that all my friends were gone from the tent. Freezing cold and absolutely terrified, I looked around the yard and eventually went inside the house. None of the doors were locked, and no matter where I looked, I could not find a single person. I was practically alone, scared out of my mind, standing there in my pajamas. I found a phone and called my mom, and about 15 minutes later, she picked me up and took me home. Later, I found out that my friends had moved to a different tent in the yard without telling me, and in my panic that night, I thought they had all disappeared. It was not really supernatural, but in the moment, it was the most horrifying and inexplicable thing I ever experienced during my childhood. Story 4. I was home alone one day, and it was not dark, spooky, or raining or anything like that. It was the middle of the day, and I had just gotten home from work. I usually use the bathroom with the door open when I am home alone because there is no reason not to, and I was doing my business and browsing Reddit like always when I suddenly heard the laundry room door open and then slam shut. It struck me as odd because it was only 2 in the afternoon, and my parents do not get home from work until at least 4, and my sister was supposed to be at school, though I briefly wondered if she had come home early. I yelled hello and quickly reached over to close the bathroom door, so whoever might be home would not see me, and then I heard footsteps walk into the living room and suddenly stop. I yelled again but got no response, and I thought maybe my dad was home early, listening to audiobooks with earbuds in, and just did not hear me. I finished up and walked out to see who was there, but the house was completely empty. I kept calling out as I walked through the rooms and got no answer. So I went outside and saw that the only car in the driveway was mine. At that point, I started to panic a little because the laundry room door is very heavy and extremely loud when it closes. So there was no way I had imagined it. I searched the entire house, checked the patio, the side yards, and everywhere else, but there was nothing and no one. I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of fear and ran back inside, sat down on the living room couch, and waited for something to happen. Nothing did. There were no noises, no footsteps, no doors opening, just silence. Eventually, I went back to my room and never heard anything like it again. And honestly, it would have scared the hell out of me if I had not already taken care of that problem beforehand. Story 5. It is not incredibly scary, but it has always struck me as deeply strange. When I was about 12 years old, my family moved into a new house, new to us but actually quite old, in the same village but down a different lane. Part of the house used to be a bungalow, so my room and my sister's room were on the ground floor at the end of a long hallway. And the entire ground floor had walnut flooring with a Persian rug placed outside my bedroom door, so our feet would not be cold in the morning. Every single night around 11 or so, I would hear footsteps walking slowly down the hallway, starting near the guest suite, passing by our rooms, and continuing toward the living room. I was always already in bed when it happened, and everyone else in the house was as well. You know how you can recognize family members just by the way they walk or open doors? And I knew for certain it was not anyone in my family, especially because the sound was clearly outdoor shoes clacking against the wood, and everyone in our house wore slippers indoors. The footsteps would start loudly on the wooden floor, move past my sister's room, then pause briefly as whatever it was crossed the rug outside my door, leaving a clear 3-second gap, before resuming on the other side and fading away toward the living room. Then they would return the same way, with the same pause over the rug, and continue back down the hall. I do not remember ever feeling scared, but I also never once got out of bed to investigate, and I would eventually fall asleep listening to the sound as it went on for a long time. About 3 or 4 weeks after we moved in, the footsteps stopped completely, and I never heard them again. And while I did not think much about it at the time, remembering it now as an adult still makes me shiver. Story 6. My brother was helping me move across the country, and we borrowed a van and loaded everything up for the final trip. Just before leaving, I checked my watch and called my girlfriend to tell her we would be on the road soon. And although I did not know it at the time, my brother also checked the clock in the kitchen. We set off but could not go faster than about 80 kilometers per hour because of how heavily loaded the van was. When we took the off-ramp into my new city, my brother suddenly said he could not remember the drive at all. And when I thought about it, I realized I could not either. We assumed we were just tired and did not think much of it until we arrived at my new place, and my girlfriend asked if I had been speeding because we were almost an hour early. When we retraced the route together, my brother and I both agreed that the last thing we clearly remembered was passing a specific gas station, and then nothing at all until the off-ramp. To this day, we have no idea what happened during that missing hour or how we could have traveled that fast, because it would not have been possible in any car, let alone a loaded van. The fact that we both independently checked the time before leaving is important to us, because one clock could have been wrong, but not both, and I had also made the call just before we left, which further limits the time window. Since then, neither of us has experienced anything strange like that again. I have no unusual memories, dreams, or marks, and no explanation, just one full hour of my life that I cannot account for. Story 7. I went to New York for work in 2006, and one day we finished early, and a few of us decided to go down to Ground Zero to look around, since none of us had ever been to New York before. We had about 3 hours before we were supposed to be at a company dinner, so we figured we would head down, walk around for a bit, then come back with plenty of time to shower and get ready, and there were 4 of us who went. Before getting on the subway, we all checked the time to make sure we had enough of it, then took the ride down and walked around the site, where there were some pictures and signs but no museum yet, and despite the traffic and bustle nearby, it felt very eerie and quiet, with all of us sensing a strange energy. We were not there long before someone in our group said we needed to hurry back because we had already been gone nearly 2 hours, which seemed impossible to me because it felt like we had just arrived. We started panicking because there was no way we would have time to take the subway back, clean up, and still make it to dinner on time, especially since we were meeting with our parent companies and needed to look presentable. We all checked our phones, watches, and clocks, and sure enough, far more time had passed than we could believe. So we practically ran back to the subway station, trying to figure out how we could possibly get ready so fast. And once on the train, we just sat there stunned by how quickly time seemed to have passed. Partway through the ride, I noticed my phone clock had gone back an hour compared to what I had seen at Ground Zero. And I knew it was different because I had checked it repeatedly while we were there. So I showed everyone and asked them to check their own devices. Suddenly, all of our clocks were back in sync, showing we still had more than 2 hours until dinner. And all four of us had experienced the same thing, with our watches and phones somehow jumping ahead an hour while we were at the site. We sat there in complete shock for the rest of the ride. And since my co-workers ranged in age from 42 to 66, it was clearly not some kind of prank. And to this day, none of us has been able to explain what happened, though it gave us chills, especially when later at dinner, someone mentioned having strange experiences in that same area recently. Story 8. When I was around 10 years old, I had an incredibly disturbing dream that started with me alone in my house during the daytime, which was small, several minutes walk from the nearest neighbor, and mostly surrounded by woods. I heard something coming slowly down the driveway, like tires crunching on gravel, but at an unnaturally slow pace. And when I went out onto the porch to investigate, I saw an old-fashioned covered wagon being pulled down the driveway, which immediately filled me with dread and made me run back inside to lock all the doors. After that, I went down the staircase into the basement, knowing I could see outside through the small window in the door. And the wagon stopped moving as soon as I was watching, with a man climbing down from the seat and standing in front of it, dressed in a black suit and a black top hat, staring straight at me through the glass. Once he knew I saw him, he walked to the back of the wagon and pulled off the cover, revealing people hanging from the supports at the top, feet dangling with ropes around their necks, looking dead, until the man did something that caused their heads to begin inflating in a grotesque, almost cartoonish way, with bulging eyes and red faces, all while he kept looking at me, and I knew he was going to do the same thing to me next. I woke up absolutely terrified, and to make it worse, the power was out, so it took me an agonizingly long time to make my way to my parents' room and sleep on the floor there. The truly unsettling part is that I never told anyone about this dream because it was so strange. But about 2 years ago, my family started talking about the freakiest dreams we had ever had, and I decided enough time had passed to mention it, leaving out many details until I got to the part about the wagon coming down the driveway, when my younger sister suddenly looked at me and asked if the man was wearing a top hat. We questioned each other and realized we remembered most of the details the same way. And while I have tried to rationalize it by thinking one of us must have told the other and forgotten, I distinctly remember never sharing it because it felt too bizarre. And even now, thinking about it still freaks me out, making it one of the strangest dreams I have ever had. Story 9. My aunt's house is haunted, and she moved there when my cousin was about 2 years old. She realized almost immediately that something was off, but she stayed because whatever was there did not seem malicious. My cousin, who is now around 30, grew up in that house knowing it was haunted, along with my 2 younger cousins, and they talked about it so casually that it felt like just another part of daily life. I have always been really into spooky stuff, so after hearing these stories over and over at family gatherings, I asked to spend the night specifically to experience it myself when I was about 17. And what happened that night still sticks with me. My cousin, my aunt, and one of my aunt's friends were watching the movie Carrie, and it was wintertime, with their fireplace having not worked all week. At one point, my cousin said out loud, asking when the movie was finally going to get scary, and right at that moment, the glass patio door in the kitchen suddenly opened. After the movie, we went outside to the hot tub because we were cold, and when we came back a while later, the fireplace was suddenly blasting full heat. My aunt just laughed it off and said the ghosts were messing with us, explaining that they like to play pranks like that. Later, after everyone went to sleep, I was lying on the couch while my cousin slept on the floor next to me, and I started hearing footsteps coming up from the basement. From where I was lying, I could clearly see the basement door, and I heard the footsteps come all the way up the stairs and stop at the top. I was absolutely terrified, waiting for the door to open, but nothing happened, and after a moment, the footsteps went back down the stairs. This repeated over and over, someone walking up and down the basement stairs for about 30 minutes. I finally woke my cousin and told him to listen, because it was crystal clear that someone was walking there. And he just looked at me calmly and said that it happens every night and told me to go back to sleep. I was completely mortified. I have heard many more stories from my aunt since then, and on other visits I have seen lights turn on and off and heard more footsteps. And she believes they are children, especially since they live across the street from a school where people have also reported strange activity. Story 10. When I was in high school, my uncle would pay me a few dollars to help babysit his kids with my aunt. They lived in a nice 2-story house near the water, and the kids were about 3 and 6 years old at the time. One day I was sitting in their den on my phone when I started hearing a baby crying upstairs, and assuming it was the 3-year-old, I went to the bottom of the stairs to check if my aunt was already handling it. I called out to her a couple of times but got no response, and the crying continued, so I called out once more and then started walking up the stairs. That was when I suddenly heard my aunt and both kids laughing and playing outside. Every hair on my body stood up, and I felt a cold chill run straight down my spine. I quietly turned around, walked back down the stairs, went straight to my car and drove away, and I could still hear the baby crying as I closed the door behind me. A few years later, while drunk at a family party, I told my uncle the story, and he told me that he and my aunt used to hear the baby crying as well. He then explained that the previous owners had lost a child in that upstairs room due to sudden infant death syndrome, and being extremely religious, he had a mass said for the baby, after which the crying stopped completely. Even now, talking about it still gives me chills. Story 11. Last year I was staying in a hotel with my mom, and one night as I was lying in bed, I noticed what looked like a human silhouette about 2 meters away from me. At first I assumed it was just a shadow and tried to ignore it, but I could not, so I turned on the light and it disappeared, only to reappear when I turned the lights back off. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but there was absolutely nothing in the room that could have cast a shadow shaped like that, and I checked several times to be sure. What made it worse was realizing that the shadow had not been there on any of the previous nights, and nothing in the room had been moved, and it genuinely looked exactly like a human figure. I had never believed in ghosts before, but at that moment I was terrified, and I turned away from it and eventually fell asleep because I was too scared to look. The next morning I told my mom about it and she brushed it off, saying I was probably imagining things, and the shadow never appeared again during the rest of the stay. A few days after we got back home, my mom was in the kitchen while I was studying, and without even turning around, she asked if I remembered the shadow of a person I had seen at the hotel. And when I said yes, she calmly told me that she had seen it too, and my blood turned ice cold. She admitted that she did not want to tell me at the time because she did not want to scare me, and she said she believed it might have been the ghost of her best friend who had taken her own life just days before, especially since my mom had spent hours that evening writing her a long letter as a form of closure. And maybe if ghosts do exist, she was there to say goodbye. Story 12. I am an outdoorsman and very experienced with hunting, camping, hiking, and general survival, and I am extremely familiar and comfortable with wildlife, which is why what happened to me and my cousin still haunts me to this day. I was charged by what I genuinely believe was some kind of cryptid, often described as a dogman, and I am certain it was not a bear, because bears cannot move the way this thing did, and it was not a normal wolf either, because wolves cannot comfortably run on 2 legs, whereas what charged us seemed completely natural doing so. This happened around June or July of 2007, when I was about 17 years old and more cocky than I should have been, though still knowledgeable about the outdoors. My family owned a cabin in northwest Wisconsin, where I practically grew up during the summers, and I knew those woods well, though at night it was common sense to stay in the cabin or near the bonfire by the beach because of bears, wolves, and cougars. One unsettling thing was, that when you sat by the fire at night, you could clearly see the tree line from the beach and the fire pit, and you always felt like something was watching you from the darkness. Even though during the day the woods felt completely normal until this incident. It happened sometime between noon and early afternoon, while my cousin and I were having an airsoft battle, with me dressed in full woodland camouflage and him not. I retreated onto the all-terrain vehicle trail to gain a tactical advantage, and the game carried us about 200 meters into the woods, roughly a third of the way up the trail, until we stopped at the edge of a clearing to talk, with him standing about 10 feet from me. Wanting to mess with him, I suddenly shushed him and said that we were being watched, and he froze. And that was when I realized the woods had gone completely silent. I started scanning the tree line and the far edge of the clearing from left to right, and that was when I saw it. Its teeth gave it away first, panting as it stared directly at my cousin. And what I saw was a wolf as large as a black bear, easily 300 pounds or more, but it was not normal. This thing was upright on two legs, crouched beside a tree, gripping the trunk with what looked like an arm ending in a clawed hand, and it had reddish-brown fur. I told my cousin that we had to leave immediately, and he took off running, and when I looked back, the creature locked onto us and sprinted several steps on two legs before dropping down toward all fours. I turned and ran, hearing it crashing through the brush right behind us, close enough that I was certain we were about to be caught. But for reasons I cannot explain, it stopped pursuing us once we broke out of the tree line and headed toward the cabin. What stuck with me most was its sheer size, because when it stood upright, it had to be nearly 7 feet tall, and where front paws should have been, it had large, unmistakably clawed hands. I have tried to rationalize it ever since, but wolves do not get that large and cannot sprint on two legs, and bears do not move like that either. And as ridiculous as it sounds, the closest description I can come up with is something like a werewolf or dogman. Story 13. Growing up, our house was extremely haunted, and even though it is not as active today, I still get chills whenever I go home to visit. A few years before I was born, my great-grandmother died in what later became my bedroom, which had been her sitting and television room. And both my parents and I clearly remember walking into that room and smelling strong, rose-scented perfume, like someone had poured an entire bottle onto the carpet. According to my parents, it was the exact same perfume she wore almost every day until she died. As a child and teenager, I saw multiple apparitions in that house, including my maternal grandfather, who died in the 1950s when my mom was only 3 years old, meaning I never met him in life. Yet one day while I was in the kitchen, I saw a man in a brown suit with a thin black tie standing in the doorway, looking directly at me before vanishing, and I recognized him instantly from old family photographs. Over the years, I also saw blue lights or orbs appear during the daytime in different rooms, felt sudden cold spots, felt invisible hands touch me, heard footsteps when I was home alone, and even watched drawers and cupboards open on their own right in front of me. None of it ever felt outright terrifying, but it was deeply unsettling, and there was no denying that something strange was happening in that house. Story 14. My fiance and I used to live in a very old apartment building that had an unsettling atmosphere from the moment you stepped inside, the kind of place that just felt wrong, and the apartment itself was tiny and filled with neighbors who were all extremely strange. One normal weeknight, we were getting ready for bed, feeling comfortable and relaxed, and we left our bedroom door open so the air could flow better, even though the space was small and had window units in both rooms. At some point, I woke up and realized I was in a semi-lucid dream, aware of my surroundings as I began scanning the room. And I noticed something in the recessed ceiling area of the narrow hallway just outside our bedroom. A completely black figure appeared to be hanging from the upper corner of the hallway, suspended unnaturally, and when I blinked, the figure was suddenly standing next to my bed. It looked like the silhouette of a woman, and she was staring directly at my fiancée as she slept beside me, and panic set in immediately. The figure reached out and touched my fiancé's shoulder, and I watched her body go limp, as if the life had drained out of her, which sent me into complete terror. I lunged at the figure, grabbing at it in desperation and screaming, and that was when I woke up, my scream carrying over into reality. I immediately checked my fiancée and realized she was alive, and the relief was overwhelming. When she woke up and asked what was wrong, I told her everything, and she said she had also had a strange dream that night, describing the feeling that something unnatural had been watching her while she slept. Neither of us got any sleep after that, and we moved out of that apartment as soon as we possibly could, and to this day we never sleep with our bedroom door open anymore. Story 15. I have an old dog named Casey, and when she was a puppy and a younger dog, she used to climb the stairs and lie down on a very specific step, which I think was the third or fourth step from the top. She would stick her head through the gap between the step and the bottom railing of the banister and stare out over the living room, staying there for hours at a time, and sometimes even falling asleep with her head still poking out. My mom works at the local high school, and every summer she has to take safety courses there. And one year during one of these courses, she went out to lunch with several people, including a woman she did not know. They started talking, and eventually my mom mentioned the town we lived in. And it turned out this woman had grown up in the same town. She asked what section of town my mom lived in, and when my mom told her, the woman said she had grown up in that exact section. Then she asked what street we lived on, and unbelievably, it was the same street. And soon they realized that this woman had actually grown up in the very house we were living in. As they kept talking, my mom mentioned that we had a dog named Casey, and the woman said she also had a dog named Casey when she lived there, and then casually added that her dog used to sit on the exact same step on the staircase and stick her head out through the banister just like ours did. Story 16. I grew up in a very small town that has recently gained a bit of fame for being haunted after one of those ghost television shows filmed an episode there. But long before any of that attention, something strange happened to me. One night during the summer when I was about 14 years old, my mom and I were taking one of our usual evening walks down Main Street, something we did often. As we were walking, she stopped in front of a furniture store house in a very old building, like most of the buildings on Main Street, and we stood there looking through the windows at the furniture and chatting. Suddenly, I turned to my mom and told her that we needed to leave immediately. She asked me why, and I insisted that we had to go, telling her there was something bad in the store and that it was a dangerous place and we should not be there. And even though she protested at first because she was enjoying herself, we ended up leaving. The strange part is that I have absolutely no memory of that conversation or even stopping at the store at all. And I only know it happened because my mom told me the story years later and asked if I remembered it, which I did not. On its own, that would not mean much because teenagers say strange things all the time. But what unsettles me is what came later. My mom is friends with a woman who works for the town and helps organize activities and manage historical matters, and at some point she gave a tour of the town to a film crew that included a psychic. I am personally skeptical of psychics, but according to my mom, when the group reached that same furniture store, the psychic refused to go inside and claimed there was a lot of evil there that wanted to harm people. So they moved on. When my mom heard that story, she immediately thought of the night I told her we had to leave that exact spot. And now many people in the town believe that building, along with several others, is haunted. Story 17. I was around 11 years old, relaxing in my room playing on my handheld game system, while my mom was in the next room doing laundry, and I knew my dad and brother were out, so the house was very quiet. From downstairs, I clearly heard a voice call out, "Mummy!" And since I knew my little sister had been playing downstairs earlier, I waited a few minutes and then assumed my mom had not heard it. After a bit, my mom suddenly rushed into my room looking confused and wide-eyed, and asked if I had heard that too, and I casually replied that of course I had, and that my sister must want something from her. At that point, my mom went pale and told me that my sister was actually out at a friend's house, and we both did that nervous half-laugh people do when they are scared but trying not to show it, and I stayed in her room with her instead of being alone until everyone else came home. To this day, I do not know what we heard, because the television was off, but there have always been rumors that our house is haunted by a little girl. My mom later explained that at first it did not bother her because she works with children and often hears imagined voices, like when you think your phone has gone off when it has not. But the moment she realized that I heard it too was when she truly became frightened. Story 18. When I was around 7 or 8 years old, I used to have sleepovers at my grandma's house very often, because my aunties were only a few years older than me. so it worked out perfectly. One night I was lying in bed around 3 in the morning, and both of my aunties were already asleep. So I rolled over and looked toward their toy horses sitting on a desk, and I swear that they were moving. I could clearly see their black silhouettes galloping across the surface, and instead of panicking, I did what felt logical at the time and rolled back over, convincing myself it was just my imagination and falling back asleep. About a year ago, one of my aunties described the exact same thing happening to her, seeing the toy horses move in the same way. It turns out that many people have had strange experiences in that house over the years, including an ex of my uncle who claimed to see a strange man standing in the corner of a room and at the bottom of the stairs, televisions randomly turning on and off, objects being moved without explanation, a wardrobe door that would suddenly become so stuck that even a grown man could not open it and then swing open on its own, light bulbs randomly bursting, which could have been electrical, shadows appearing in rooms even when the curtains were closed and no one was moving, infrequent loud banging and heavy footsteps upstairs, even when no one was there. Especially strange considering the neighbor was an elderly woman who could barely manage the stairs, and the footsteps sounded like those of a heavy adult man. Story 19. The year I started high school, my parents moved us into a new house, and it was intensely haunted. I have struggled with insomnia since I was about 14 years old, and many nights I would be awake and hear someone running up and down the hallway, sometimes accompanied by giggling and the sound of hands hitting the walls. When I was home alone cleaning, I would often hear what sounded like a small child giggling or quietly talking nearby. And although I had 5 siblings, on those occasions I was completely alone in the house. My parents' bedroom was always unnaturally cold, and there were times when I heard the sound of someone typing on the computer keyboard, even though no one was near it. More than once I came home from school and went into my room, knowing I was the first one there, and that my siblings had not been inside, and found my belongings moved around, including a porcelain doll my grandmother had given me placed in strange locations, with small doll-sized footprints pressed into the carpet as if someone had been playing with it. Later on, I learned that a little girl had once been murdered on the land where the house was built, before the house even existed, and I still have countless stories about that place that I could share. Story 20. When I was about 5 years old, my family was visiting my grandparents, and I was sleeping alone in a spare bedroom on a large brass bed, while a pull-out bed stored underneath had been set up for my brother, with a small closet in the opposite corner of the room. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of hinges creaking, and at first I thought it was the pull-out bed springs. But my brother was sound asleep and not moving. I looked toward the closet and saw the door slowly cracking open, and then a small man poked his head out, with a head that seemed too large for his body and large eyes that looked directly at me in the darkness. He shuffled forward, and I remember the sound of his movement, stopping after a short distance to look at me again before crouching and shuffling forward a few more feet. And when he was a couple of yards from the bed, he dove underneath the pull-out bed, moving through the metal and springs before I felt him pass under my bed, and everything went quiet. I could barely breathe when a second small man stepped out of the closet and did the exact same thing, looking at me, moving forward, looking again, and diving beneath the beds. I was completely frozen with fear and unsure whether to scream or run. And when a third one appeared, I finally screamed, and he rushed back into the closet just before my mother came into the room. She turned on the light, checked the beds in the closet, and found nothing. As an adult, I understand that I must have been hallucinating or dreaming with my eyes open, something that happened a few more times during my childhood with different dreams, but this one has never left me. And the image of those little men marching across the room and staring at me with their dark eyes is something I will never forget. Story 21. While this is not within the realm of the supernatural, it is extremely difficult to explain and remains one of the scariest moments of my life. When I was about 15 years old, 4 friends and I were exploring a massive cemetery near the city where I live. It is very old, with sprawling hills that stretch for at least a mile or two, making it impossible to see everything at once, which is an important detail. There are graves dating back to the 1800s, along with beautiful mausoleums and churches that have slowly deteriorated over time. It was a bright and sunny day, And even though the cemetery is located near a rougher part of the city, we felt completely safe. At one point, we sat down near one of the more intricate gravestones to relax in the sun, and my friends were facing away from me when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A man was walking up the hill toward us with a shirt pulled over his face, two eye holes cut into it, and he was holding a large machete. I know how insane this sounds, and I know it could have been a prank or even a fake weapon, but I know exactly what I saw. My friends turned around after noticing my stare, and they froze as well when they saw him. The man slowed to a stop, stood there staring at all of us for a moment that felt endless, even though it was probably no more than 15 seconds, then suddenly turned around and ran back down the hill the way he came. We did not hesitate and ran out of the cemetery as fast as we could. I never found out who he was, what he was doing, or where he was going, and I had no intention of sticking around to find out. I did not contact the authorities because I was a stupid 15-year-old kid, but I checked the news later that night and there was no report of a man with a machete and no related crimes. I will never forget that day, and while I do have another story from that same cemetery that is more paranormal, it was nowhere near as terrifying as that encounter. Story 22. I was very young at the time and remember little of the supernatural events myself, but my dad has recounted them to me many times over the years. This all began when my dad was trying to turn his life around after years of substance use and running with a bad crowd, as he wanted to be a better father to his kids. He did not quit everything immediately and still drank heavily, often staying out late. On one occasion while he was drinking, he vividly remembers seeing black smoke pour out of his can, slowly rising and forming into a devilish shape that laughed and told him he was going to die. And when he dropped the can in terror, the apparition vanished. Shaken and convinced he was drunk, he went home. But that was not the last time something like this happened. Sometime later, while my mom was out running errands, my dad was home watching me and my brothers, and by then he was drinking less, working more, and our life was relatively stable. He was helping my brothers bathe and get ready for bed while I watched television, and I remember him suddenly running through the living room, wearing only boxers and a white shirt before bolting outside. What happened was that while he was in my brother's room drying them off, the room began to darken unnaturally as thick black smoke filled the space and eventually consumed everything. He said his arms felt strange, and when he looked down, it appeared as though something was moving beneath his skin, crawling in every direction. And then he heard a whispering voice that became taunting and threatening, telling him to scratch his arms. He felt something grab him from behind, preventing him from running. But instead of panicking, he began yelling and cursing at whatever it was, calling it a coward, until he managed to break free and run outside to get help from a neighbor. Only after escaping did he realize we were still inside the house. And when my mom returned, they rushed in to find us completely unharmed and the room back to normal. Over the following months, the black smoke continued to appear around my dad in different places and situations, creating an extremely stressful period for our family. I personally only witnessed the strange effects it had on him, but eventually everything stopped after we sought help. And although there are more details and earlier experiences from my dad's childhood, this is the part of the story that has always stayed with me the most. Story 23. When I was little, around 4 years old, and I am 19 now, I woke up screaming and crying in a bedroom filled with illuminated holographic butterflies that were every color of the rainbow, and the sound of their wings was loud and deeply unsettling. They were flying everywhere in a swirling, tornado-like pattern, and they appeared similar to how long exposure photography captures motion, leaving glowing trails behind them. My parents ran into my room, shocked and confused by my reaction, and to this day I still wonder whether they saw them too, or if it was only me. My dad picked me up, and both of them rushed me outside, and we were staying on a farm in Alabama that grew peanuts and other crops, although I do not remember why since I was too young. My mother later passed away due to drinking and substance use, and my father is no longer in my life, so I am unable to ask either of them whether they witnessed the same thing. I have always wondered if there is any connection between butterflies and something darker or unexplained, or if it could have been related to the land itself, because I know nothing about its history. There was also an alien poster in the room that said "Believe," which I vividly remember finding terrifying at the time. And even now, the memory of that night still unsettles me. Story 24. To be honest, I have many experiences like this and continue to have them wherever I go. But two stand out the most. One time, my siblings and I were sitting on the couch watching television while our parents were at work, when suddenly there was a loud slam, and we watched as all the hallway doors began slamming shut by themselves, one after another, leading toward the room we were in. We ran outside in fear and then came back in, only for the doors to open and slam shut again 3 more times. One of my earliest memories is from when I was little and had a bedroom upstairs, where I would wake up to the lights flickering on and off and see no one near the switch before falling back asleep. One night, convinced my siblings were messing with me, I ran downstairs to catch them and watched the light switch moving by itself, stopping just as I reached it. As I stood there, I saw a black mass move across the room and heard a knock at the door, even though it was around midnight. I went to open it without thinking, then decided to look out the window first and saw a completely pitch black figure standing there, like a void in the darkness. I ran back upstairs and from then on stayed in my room whenever the lights flickered. Over the years, I continued seeing more figures like that, and shadow people, as they are often called, have become a strangely common occurrence for me. Story 25. I am a British Muslim, and in my religion there is a belief in beings called jinn, which are said to have various abilities, including flight and shape-shifting, and they can see us while remaining unseen unless they choose otherwise, having been created from smokeless fire. When I was in Pakistan visiting family who lived in a small village on the outskirts of a city, there was a woman there who was widely known for being unstable, to the point where she would throw stones at people who stared at her. One day I noticed her staring directly at me without blinking, which deeply unsettled me. The following night, during a heavy rainstorm in the middle of summer around 1 in the morning, my cousins and I were on the roof when we heard something below and saw that same woman walking through the street, loudly talking to herself while holding a candle. The flame was blue, and despite the heavy rain, it did not go out. We ran inside and prayed, and the next day we spoke to the local imam, who said he suspected she might be possessed, but could not confirm it since she had not harmed anyone. When we told my uncle, he became annoyed and dragged me with him to her house, where she claimed to have no memory of that night and dismissed it as children having wild imaginations. But as we were leaving, she looked at me and quietly said, "Poor Jimmy." I did not understand at the time, but after returning to England, I learned that my cat Jimmy had died on the same day she said those words, and that coincidence has never stopped haunting me. Story 26. When I was younger, I was extremely paranoid, to the point that I would bathe with the door open, something I mostly blame on my brother, who loved to scare me with stories about people watching through windows. One day, while bathing with the door open, enjoying the warmth, I looked out into the hallway and saw a grayish-white figure hobble past the doorway, and I immediately began crying and refused to leave the bathroom until one of my parents came to get me. About 5 years later, after living a normal life with nothing strange happening aside from mild depression, I stayed overnight at a friend's summer home in Palm Springs and fell asleep quickly on a futon. I then had a vivid dream where I woke up in my own bedroom, filled with a dark blue light that felt thick, as if it coated the room rather than illuminated it, and I saw the same grayish figure hobble in from the hallway. It was tall, emaciated, and unnaturally thin, and it climbed onto my bookshelf and looked down at me before asking in a distant, echoing voice what I was doing, then calmly told me its job was to watch me. I woke up around 4 in the morning, relieved to be back at my friend's house, but days later I heard strange, trilling laughter while drifting off to sleep, and felt myself being lifted and dropped onto my bed, and then onto the floor. I woke the next morning on the hardwood beside my bed with red marks around my shoulders where I remembered being grabbed, even though I had not sleepwalked in years. I do not claim this is proof of anything supernatural, and it could all be strange dreams or psychological phenomena, but experiencing it was terrifying and has stayed with me ever since. Story 27. When I was 11 years old, my uncle passed away, and I remember waking up in the middle of the night because someone was gently rubbing my feet, and I expected to see my dad. But instead I saw who I later understood to be my grandmother on his side. She smiled at me, and I fell back asleep. And a little while later, I woke up again to find my dad awake, which was not unusual because he never slept much. And we talked for a bit, and I told him what I had seen and felt. And he told me that she was not there to hurt me, and that something must have happened in our family that made her want to show a loving presence. We found out about my uncle's death the next morning. 5 years ago, my husband and I lived in upstate New York in a small town called Gouverneur, about an hour from his base where he sometimes had 24-hour duty. The house had a front door with a screen door leading into a mudroom, a door to the garage on the left, and then a solid wooden door leading into a hallway that opened into the living room and kitchen, with a back door in the living room leading to a small unfenced patio and a grassy area that bordered the woods. One night around 9 in the evening, I was on the phone with my mom, who was across the country, when I heard the screen door open and close. Then the main door unlock, open, close, and relock, even though everything was locked from inside, followed by silence and then a quiet knock on the mudroom door. I froze, thinking it was strange because my husband would have called if he got off early, and my mom could hear everything since she was on speaker. I waited, hung up a few minutes later, and sat watching television when the back door screen opened and the handle moved even though the deadbolt held, which made me uneasy enough to call my husband, who was in the barracks, and he asked a friend from his unit across the street to keep an eye on the house. Shortly after, the back door was tried again, and I called my parents in a panic. And while we were talking, I heard the front door slam and another knock on the mudroom door that sounded exactly like my husband. And I almost opened it until I stopped, went upstairs, locked myself in, and looked outside to see that his car was not there. Around that time, our friend across the street came out and checked the perimeter, and then my neighbor banged on my back door yelling not to open anything because the police had been called. It turned out that several inmates had escaped from a nearby state prison and were trying houses to hide. And while they never got inside my home, over the following months we would sometimes wake up to find the mudroom door wide open, despite it being deadbolted the night before. Story 28. Back in about 2002, when I was around 21 years old, I was in the Marines stationed in North Carolina and living in a two-person barracks room similar to a college dorm. And one weekend, my roommate left to visit his dad in South Carolina. Growing up, I had always been more afraid of aliens than ghosts because of movies and shows I loved. So when I tried to sleep alone that Friday night and started hearing strange sounds like alien Morse code, I was terrified. I turned on the light, searched the room, found nothing, and tried again, only to hear what sounded like a machine starting up, spinning faster and slower, and then what seemed like two aliens having a quiet conversation just a few feet away. I froze under the covers and stayed that way until morning. The next day, none of my friends had experienced anything similar, and that night it all happened again. The strange coded noises, mechanical whirring, high-pitched sounds, and what sounded like calm alien chatter, and I spent the entire night convinced I was about to be abducted. When my roommate returned the next day, he told me I looked awful, and I finally told him everything. And instead of laughing, he listened and then opened his wall locker, revealing that his television and original Xbox had been left on. As soon as he did, the exact sounds I had been hearing started playing from the screen, and I learned that leaving the Xbox on caused a strange white noise screensaver that perfectly mimicked what I had heard. I was incredibly relieved to learn there had been a real source for the sounds, and that I had not imagined any of it. Story 29. One evening around 11 in the evening, I was sitting in my living room playing my bass guitar with all the lights on when I suddenly felt like gravity weakened, similar to that sinking sensation you get right before a roller coaster drops. I looked up from my instrument and saw a roughly 7-foot-tall, oval-shaped, rippling mass that was darker than black, like the complete absence of light itself. And I stared directly at it as it slowly drifted across the room and passed straight through the wall. I turned around in shock and noticed a small white sphere, about the size of a golf ball, hovering near the top of the doorframe, where it stayed for a second or two before shooting diagonally down into the floor. And almost immediately after that, the strange gravity sensation vanished. About a year later, after moving into an apartment with my mom, I was in the kitchen alone around midday, while she was at work when I suddenly felt her presence, That unmistakable feeling that someone is standing nearby, even though you are not looking at them. I instinctively turned to speak to her, and instead saw a humanoid figure standing about a foot in front of me, roughly chest height on me since I am 6 feet 4 inches tall, with no clear facial features, and its entire form vibrating in place while swirling with red, green, and silver colors. I looked straight at it and had the distinct impression that it realized I was aware of it, and instead of turning away, it seemed to turn itself inside out before speeding down the hallway and straight into a closed closet door. I calmly walked over, opened the door, and found nothing inside. And what disturbed me most was that I felt no fear at all, reacting to it as casually as if I had just finished washing dishes before going to watch television without another thought. Story 30. When I was around 9 years old, I lived in the English countryside in a tiny village of about 80 people with a long history dating back to the 11th century, documented in the Domesday records. And our home was a restored 17th century building that had once been a primary school in the 1800s, still showing signs of its past like stone markings where changing cubicles once stood. One night I woke up desperately thirsty and needed a glass of water, but I hated going downstairs at night because the house was pitch black and the light switch was at the bottom of the stairs, forcing you to descend into darkness while feeling for the banister and hoping nothing was there. The bathroom taps were running brown water at the time, so I had no choice but to go to the kitchen, where a massive oak door with heavy iron latches had to be opened, making a loud clunking sound. As I pulled it open and stared into the darkness beyond, I heard a distinct slap, slap, slap sound, like bare feet on stone, growing fainter before stopping abruptly. Normally, this would not have bothered me because we had a feral cat that often bolted through the kitchen and out the cat flap. But this time, I never heard the flap swing. Assuming it was still the cat, I walked down the stone steps and flicked on the light, fully expecting to see it, only to find the kitchen completely empty, with nowhere it could have hidden. That moment is burned into my memory, along with the lump in my throat and the overwhelming dread that followed, as my imagination filled with thoughts of ghosts and demons. And I immediately ran back upstairs 3 steps at a time, slammed my door shut, turned on the lights, and went to bed still thirsty, too scared to ever go back down. Story 31. When I was 17 years old, my vovô, which is Portuguese for grandfather, passed away from skin cancer that eventually spread to his brain. And out of his 12 grandchildren, he and I were especially close because my parents were divorced and I was able to spend long stretches of time with him during the 3-hour drive visits. Losing him was one of the worst days of my life, but in a strange way, it also shaped me and helped me grow. About a year and a half later, during my senior year, I was attending a Protestant private school, and we traveled from Texas to Illinois for a large church camp, where schools from all over the country gathered. During one of the services near the end, when everyone was up front worshiping in their own ways, I was standing with my eyes closed, head down, appearing to pray, when I suddenly heard a voice say hello to me. At first, I assumed it was someone from my group, but when I heard it again and looked up, I saw my vovô standing right in front of me. The shock was overwhelming, and I physically jumped back, breaking down into uncontrollable tears. My teacher rushed over, assuming I was having an emotional religious moment, but all I could say over and over was that I had seen my grandfather. To this day, I believe it was a moment where he was allowed to come see me one last time, and even though it terrified me in the moment, it is an experience I will never forget. Story 32. When I was around 8 years old, my father and I lived in an apartment where a series of strange things happened over several years. One night in the middle of a hot Texas summer, we both woke up to the apartment feeling unbearably hot, well over 100 degrees, and discovered that the heater was running at full blast, even though the breaker for it had been turned off and the thermostat was set far too high for me to reach without standing on a chair. Neither of us had turned it on. No one else had been inside, and the apartment was locked. Another night while we were watching television, we heard a loud metallic crashing sound from the kitchen, and when my father went to check, several refrigerator magnets, including alphabet ones, were sitting in the sink, even though they would have had to travel several feet through the air to get there. On another occasion, framed pictures that had been hanging in the hallway somehow ended up standing upright against the opposite wall, even though if they had simply fallen, they should have landed flat on the floor. During this time, I also experienced frequent nightmares involving chains clanking and shadowy figures moving in the dark, which felt very real to me. At one point, my father decided to record the apartment while it was silent, and when we listened back, we clearly heard voices speaking German as if they were in the next room, despite it being late at night and us not having nearby neighbors. After researching the area, we learned the apartments were built along a ridge historically used by German settlers as a lookout point. I still do not know what truly happened there, but after nearly 10 years, we eventually moved out, leaving behind a long list of unexplained events. Story 33. My godfather, who was basically my dad, suffered a mild stroke while I was away at college across the country, and when the semester ended, I came back home to help take care of him, because between the stroke, a bad back, and diabetes, he struggled to walk and often relied on a quad cane, sometimes collapsing when his legs gave out and being unable to lift himself back up. I ended up caring for him almost 24/7, and the stress turned me into such a light sleeper that every time he moved or got up, I woke instantly, waiting for him to safely return before I could even think about sleeping again. We were poor, he was a hoarder, and the house was in bad shape, so we shared the same room with a window air conditioner, and instead of a door, he had installed an extending rod with a thick plastic shower curtain and extremely loud metal rings, something he was obsessive about closing behind him every single time. One night I woke to the sound of footsteps behind me in the darkness, facing the wall as usual, and followed my routine, listening as the steps moved toward the doorway. The shower curtain was violently flung aside, and more footsteps continued down the hallway into the rest of the house. I lay there for what felt like 5 to 10 minutes, growing more anxious, and as I sat up to check on him, I realized the curtain was still wide open, something he would never do, and those footsteps had been far too fast and heavy to be his. My spine went cold with fear, and I grabbed the aluminum baseball bat I kept nearby as I stared into the dim hallway, only to suddenly hear coughing from the other side of the room. My godfather was still lying in bed. Convinced someone had broken in, I searched the entire house with the bat in my hands, ready for the worst. But I found no one and no signs of entry, and sleep did not come easily for the rest of that night. Story 34. The worst moment of my life happened when I was 19 and working a truly awful job, the kind you take just to survive, and it was the day after Halloween. I had gone out with friends the night before, but took it easy because I had an early shift the next morning, starting around 7, so I left my house at about 6:30 for the 20-minute walk to work along fairly busy roads. I had walked that route many times and usually felt safe, although there was one stretch near a bridge where the road became wooded on both sides with no houses nearby. From the moment I stepped out of my house that morning, I had a horrible feeling in my gut, a sick, instinctive sense that something was wrong, and my heart felt erratic enough that I had to calm myself down and tell myself I was being silly. Even so, I took my earphones out, closed my bag properly so it would not make noise, and stayed as close to the road as possible, thinking it would be safer if anything happened. It was starting to get light but still dim, and about halfway along the route I noticed a man standing on the opposite side of the road ahead of me. I kept walking and passed him, but shortly after I realized he was now on my side of the road, just as I was approaching the most secluded part of the walk. My heart started pounding, and I could hear his footsteps getting closer behind me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself there were cars around and that I could flag one down if needed, even though something inside me knew I was not being paranoid. As the houses disappeared and I stepped onto the bridge, the traffic suddenly stopped, and there were no cars coming from either direction. I walked faster, and then I felt him right behind me, close enough that there was no doubt he was following me. He grabbed my arm, and when I turned to look at him, he was laughing, a deeply unsettling laugh. And when I tried to scream, no sound came out. I felt him pulling me toward him, and I yanked back, stepping into the road, and he lost his footing on the curb and fell, giving me just enough time to run. I flagged down 2 cars, and one driver took me up the road where we found the man, and the driver restrained him until the police arrived. I was in complete shock, vomiting, hyperventilating, and completely overwhelmed. My dad came, the police arrested the man, and despite my anger, he was later released because he had no prior record and claimed he was only trying to scare me.